Hi guys! It's crazy to think that we're already on episode 3. Let's not waste any time and just hop right into this week's episode. Before I jump into this week's case, I just want to give a disclaimer that this case talks about sexual assault, the targeting of sex workers, and decapitation. It's a very graphic case, and I want to give everyone listening a warning before continuing on any further. Now let's dive in. I'm your host, Emily, and this week's case is pretty grueling, so I'm warning you now, you may want to turn your lights on. Let's rewind to 1977. A New Jersey detective, Alan Greco, was called to investigate a very meticulous case. Authorities had received a call about a young woman being reported as missing in Little Ferry, New Jersey. The call came from her husband, who was out of town on a business trip. The young woman, Marion Carr, had missed a date with her mother-in-law, which was very out of character for her, and it raised suspicion for her husband almost immediately. However, the couple's apartment didn't seem as though there were any signs of forced entry. There was no evidence that anything had happened to Marion, besides the fact that she was nowhere to be seen. The only thing that gave investigators any insight on Marion's possible whereabouts was a neighbor who lived in the apartment next door to the couple. According to Crime Up Close, the witness claimed that as he was backing his car out of the parking lot, he saw a person in his rearview mirror that he thought was Marion Carr's husband. It was unbeknownst to the Carrs that Marion's husband looked relatively similar to a previous tenant, Richard Cottingham. Richard was a computer operator located in New York. Dominic Volpe works closely with Richard Cottingham for nearly 13 years. Dominic was interviewed by multiple different documentaries such as Crime Close Up and a Netflix original documentary, Crime Scene, The Times Square Killer. One thing that Dominic says he recalls about Richard was that he had a hard time sitting still. He was always moving, whether it was shaking his legs or rocking in his chair, and he would do so for the entirety of his work shift. However, back in New Jersey, not long after Marion went missing, authorities received a call that there was a body found in the parking lot of her apartment complex. With this news, it was evident that Marion Carr was no longer part of a missing persons case, but was now a victim of a murder case. While authorities began to dive deeper and deeper into Marion's case to discover any information that may lead them to her killer, a series of sexual assaults were taking place in surrounding areas. These attacks were directed towards sex workers that had been taken out of the city and brought into New Jersey. They were left in motels and on the side of the roads, barely conscious. Once again, these cases would be in the exact area that Richard Cottingham was conveniently always relatively close to. Which brings me back to the interviews that were conducted on Dominic about Cottingham. Volpe claims that when he and his coworker weren't talking about their work lives, Cottingham was boasting about the S&M clubs he would visit and the prostitutes he would associate with in his free time. However, at the time, authorities didn't know this incriminating information about Cottingham. Surely if they had, their suspicions of him would grow quickly. Cottingham wasn't just the suspected culprit to these violent crimes against sex workers. It was later discovered that he was also robbing these women blind. He bragged to Volpe about how he found hotels in the surrounding areas where he was able to slip in and out of without a trace, leaving the women he brought from New York to New Jersey at these hotels. Abandoning these women wasn't the worst of the situation, though. He also boasted about how he would take whatever money these women had and wouldn't pay them for their services. Without this information being public to officials at this time, Cottingham was able to continue his gruesome attacks on these unsuspecting women. Now, just to give you a little perspective on what the city was like at this time, New York was booming. Everyone was drawn to the bright lights, up-and-coming clubs and events, and the hustle and bustle of everything. But the city was also going through a very dark time. The city was flooded with people who wanted even just the smallest taste of the real New York experience. But with so many people in such a crowded space, there is bound to be something that can turn a night of magic into everyone's worst nightmare. Violence was uprising quickly in the Times Square area, and the news was often filled with traumatizing horrors. And unfortunately, on December 2nd, 1979, at 9:30 a.m., a horrific crime would change the lives of those in the city forever. On 42nd Street, fire trucks began to flood the area in front of the Travel Inn Hotel. And by the time the police arrived, they were being led to the 4th floor. In room 417 of the hotel, a fire had emerged. Officials were immediately faced with the smell of burning flesh from those who had been trapped in the room when the fire had begun. Despite the astronomical amounts of smoke within room 417, the firefighters on duty blindly crawled in hopes of being able to save any and all that were stuck in the room. Amongst entering the room, the firemen were able to make out that there were 2 bodies, each on a twin bed. One of the men on duty instinctively began to give CPR. But something was wrong. It wasn't the smoke in the air taking the fireman's breath away. It was the woman that had been left in the room that gave him utter shock. They had been left there, both their heads and hands missing. Leaving someone in that state was something only a person with a sick and inhumane mind could do. Sergeant Jerry McQueen quickly jumped to action to try and get to the bottom of this gruesome investigation. The first issue authorities ran into was how could they possibly recognize these 2 women without anything that specifies who they were? No fingerprints, and no easy way to identify these victims. Another thing to remember is that this is 1979. There were a lot less technology to help authorities to identify these victims. With how manipulated the killer had left these women, one would think that the entire room had been disheveled, but there was little gore at the scene of the crime. If someone was beheaded and their limbs were decapitated, surely there would be puddles of blood or signs of struggle, let alone if this were to happen to 2 people. But this wasn't the case. The crime scene was eerily clean. Another suspicious part of these murders was that he left their clothes behind. If he took everything possible that there was to identify these women, why would he leave some of their belongings? It seems to me that this was a way of boasting what he had done. Now I'm saying he because the killer had signed into the hotel as any normal person would, so authorities did have insight into who the killer was. His name was Carl Wilson, and he was from Merlin, New Jersey. Carl checked in on November 29th and wasn't seen again until December 2nd, the day of the murders and the day he checked out of the Travel Inn. The only information authorities had of Carl besides his name and where he was from was a composite sketch that they were able to draw up based on a description that they were given by another guest of the hotel. Carl was seen signing into the hotel by a woman who was waiting in line behind him. She was able to give authorities a detailed enough description that they were able to draw a sketch to broadcast on the news. The biggest issue, however, is that these crimes took place in Times Square. Thousands of people were in and out during the day, plenty of traffic by foot and by vehicle. It was much too easy for someone to go unnoticed if they were trying to fly under the radar. While they were searching for their culprit, police put out pictures of the outfits that the murderer left in hopes that someone would recognize the clothes that belonged to the victims. Unfortunately, there was still no luck finding out who the attacker was, but a phone call was made to the police that may help them identify who one of the victims was. Once this tip was made to the police, medical records were researched, and it was discovered that victim number 1 was a young woman named Dita Godarzi. It was said by many sources that Dita lived in Trenton, New Jersey, but on the weekends would travel to New York by train. Dita was a sex worker in the city. Now, in no way am I saying that this means she deserved what happened to her at the travel inn. I just want to give you guys a little insight into her life. At this time, though the other victims still remained nameless and the culprit still walking the streets. The more officials investigated the case, the more information they learned about what had happened during the duration of the 3 days that the killer had these two women in his possession before ending their lives. Unfortunately, it was discovered that Dita and the unknown victim had been sexually assaulted before their lives were taken from them. The injuries that these women obtained proved to officers that they had suffered through days of abuse, and that they weren't actually killed at the same time. So not only did they have to suffer an immense amount of trauma, but they had to watch another helpless victim next to them endure very similar things. Once this information became apparent to authorities, they knew that the person they were dealing with was a sexual sadist. They knew the clock was ticking. It was important they find who this man was before he was able to harm his next victim. Now we have two suspects, both targeting sex workers in the same area and around the same time frame. Could they be alliances, or could one of these names be an alias for the real culprit? I'm going to jump a little ahead to May 15th, 1980, which is just 5 months after the attack on Dita Godarzi and Jane Doe. Firefighters are once again called, but this time they are called to the Hotel Seville in Times Square. This crime scene matched almost perfectly to the one at the travel inn. A hotel room set on fire and another poor, unsuspecting victim set manipulated and sexually harassed. However, during this specific attack, the head and hands of the victim were not taken, but this time, he removed both of her breasts and left them at the crime scene. Because the hands of the victim were not taken from the scene of the crime, officers were able to run her fingerprints, and it was discovered that the victim's name was Jean Ann Rayner. At this point, detectives would walk around the streets looking for sex workers to ask them questions on whether or not the sketch they had drawn up of the culprit was someone they had seen before. And the sad truth is that there were women who had recognized him, but they were scared of what would happen if they were to cooperate with the police. So often, they would likely say they didn't know the man in the sketches and just continue on with their day. At this point in time, authorities were running into dead end after dead end, but finally, a possible breakthrough occurred. A New York detective decided to pull files for cases that fit similar acts. They were able to find 2 police reports that were made by sex workers claiming that a man had picked them up but would not release them from his vehicle after their interaction. These reports were made in 1973 and 1974 against the same man, Richard Francis Cottingham. However, around the time that these cases occurred, Richard was questioned by police and swore that the women who filed these reports were lying. And that was that. He was free to leave. Richard was able to strike again. Not long after his attack on Jean Ann Rayner, just over the bridge into New Jersey at the Quality Inn Motel, a maid went to clean room number 132, and while she was vacuuming, her vacuum kept getting caught under the bed. When the maid went to check, she witnessed a naked woman with her arms handcuffed behind her back. The victim was 19-year-old Valerie Street. Valerie had only been in New York for a short time before her attack. She had moved there days prior from Miami. The last time she was seen was in New York, being picked up by a man and being taken to New Jersey. At the scene of the crime, authorities had noticed that there was a fingerprint on the handcuffs that the victim was wearing. A fingerprint that did not belong to Valerie. Officials believed that it was there deliberately because it was almost a perfect print. Unfortunately, no prints were found in their system because at the time the culprit did not have any reports against him in the state of New Jersey. Bergen County officials worked day and night trying to find any clue that they could, until finally an investigator pieced together that this crime was very similar to a murder that had happened just 2 years prior. The case of Marion Carr. At the very same location, except Marion was a nurse and not a sex worker. Now, not only did New York have a serial killer, so did New Jersey. The only difference was that in New Jersey, there was no suspect, and no correlation to the torso killer that was just over the bridge in New York. Around this time, Hasbrouck authorities were alerted about a disturbance in a hotel room. The hotel's management did their mandatory check-in to make sure that everything was okay. Upon their interaction with the woman in the hotel room, she told management that everything inside the room was fine and that everyone was alright. But her eyes told a different story. The hotel staff did not waste any time alerting the authorities of their suspicions. When police arrived at the scene, they were met at the far corner of the hotel by a man frantically trying to escape the premises. That wasn't the only thing about this man that raised eyebrows. During his quick escape attempt, he made sure to grab his bag. Officials arrested this man on the spot. Upon investigation, he quickly became more and more suspicious. His bag contained items such as duct tape and handcuffs. The man that police had detained was proven to be no other than Richard Cottingham. At this time, Richard was married and had 3 children. He was a successful businessman and had the life most would dream of having. He was a master of living a double life. Despite plenty of evidence being displayed against him, he denied everything. But the evidence was clear, and this gave authorities enough to get a search warrant for his home. On a very superficial level, Richard's home had seemed to be one of a loving family. He had a wife and 3 children. Cottingham was also a successful businessman working as a computer operator for Blue Cross Blue Shield. He seemed to be a very normal family man. However, once police dove deeper into Richard's home, it became very evident to them that this was a man who fantasized about murder. Upon entering Cottingham's basement, authorities were met with a locked room that his wife admitted that neither she or their 3 children had ever had access to. This room was what anyone's nightmares would be made of. Cottingham had collected memorabilia from all the women he had attacked. According to sources, Richard Cottingham was a big gambler, and now his fate was in the hands of a jury. He was about to gamble on the odds of pleading not guilty. Richard knew he was a smart man, but one of his biggest downfalls was that he did know that. He thought he was the smartest person in the room and insisted on taking the stand. Obviously, his lawyers advised against this because surely the court would find holes in his stories during the cross-examination, but he insisted. Cottingham made the claim that he had nothing to do with any of the crimes besides the one he was caught in the act of. However, he did claim that when he was fleeing the hotel from the cops, that all the activities taking place in the hotel room at the time were completely consensual. Now, I didn't find any details on this, but I'm assuming he claimed that he ran because he didn't want to be caught and his infidelity be made known. But he claimed not guilty to this. During his cross-examination, the defense was able to piece together a series of events on how exactly Richard would attack his victims. Cottingham would go out in the city with a wad of cash. He would then go and meet women and ask if he could take them out and spoil them with his winnings from his gambling successes. Richard would even go as far as to flash women the wad of cash he had in his pocket. Now, odds are this wad of cash was just smaller bills wrapped in a bigger bill, but it worked, and he was able to persuade his victims to leave with him. He would then proceed to take them to a motel, sexually assault them, and torture them. With all the evidence and witnesses against him, it was evident that he would be facing life in prison. However, Cottingham was determined to make sure that this wasn't his fate. During a break in the proceedings, Richard decided that he would take matters into his own hands by making a break for it. Of course, he didn't make it too far before a nearby officer tackled him. Cottingham was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. After the original trial, he was then tried for 2 other cases following. All these convictions led to the same outcome. Richard Francis Cottingham was a sexual sadist and a cold-blooded murderer that deserved to spend his remaining days in prison. At this time, it was determined that Richard was responsible for approximately 20 assaults and murders from the year 1967 to 1980. However, he swore his innocence for years to follow. Richard made headlines, news articles, and became a household name, one that everyone feared. He was known as the New York Ripper, the Torso Killer, the Times Square Killer, or the Times Square Ripper. But Cottingham's story didn't stop there. In 2024, Law and Crime Network posted an interview that was conducted with Richard. Richard gave them his full confession down to every single little detail. In the interview, Richard drew a diagram of what he claimed to be his killing grounds. There's been plenty of development in the area now, but before this headway, it used to be a wet, woodsy area. This area was located in Montvale, New Jersey, near Upper Saddle River. He claimed that he would never take his own vehicle to his spot. Richard would always take his victim's vehicle and back into the wooded area so that if he was spotted by police, he was able to drive away seamlessly before being completely seen or followed. Cottingham even went as far as to share that one night he had been spotted by police when he had a woman in his possession. In this particular situation, Cottingham had actually abducted this woman from either the Bergen or Garden State Mall. He was almost certain, however, that it was the Bergen Mall. In this one instance, he had gotten his victim's car stuck in the marsh-like wetlands near the entrance of the woods. The only thing to do was run, so he grabbed his victim and they headed to the woods. Once his victim had realized that the cops were nearby, she began screaming for help. Richard's first instinct was to stab his victim to quiet her down and run before the police had seen him. The cops continued to venture into the woods, assuming that is what Cottingham had done as well. Unfortunately, this was his killing grounds, and he knew this section of the woods like the back of his hand. At this point, Richard had actually pivoted back towards the entrance of the woods and headed toward the road. Once he made it to the open road, he walked all the way back to Westwood, which was approximately a 15-minute drive, so you can imagine how long he was walking for. This is how truly dedicated Cottingham was to his sadistic ways. Richard Francis Cottingham was truly a monster. During the interview posted by Law and Crime Network, you can see what kind of man he really was. He had no remorse for his victims. He talked about how he had perfected his attacks on these women and seemed almost proud of himself for doing so. While watching the interview, I got chills. The way he was so calm and cool about the entire thing makes me believe that if he were given the chance, he would without a doubt do it again. Richard Cottingham was a man that kept the entire East Coast on the edge of their seats, not knowing when he would attack next, but being almost certain that his next victim would be a sex worker, because that's who he targeted. Richard is still alive to this day and is incarcerated in New Jersey. These true crime cases are only going to continue to send more chills down your spine. These true crime cases are going to continue to send chills down your spine, so on next week's episode, you may want to turn your lights on.